I got the invitation to go on this Armed Lutheran radio show, though. You know this guy? Have you seen this? There's two things that I would like to say that make me feel safe. Number one, the fact that there is a radio show called the Armed Lutheran Podcast somewhere in the world. That makes me feel safe.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 438. Thank you so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week again this week, and welcome aboard to those of you who are new. Hope you enjoy the show, and I hope you will come back and check out next week's episode and the week after that, and maybe even go back and peruse the back catalog, all 436 previous episodes. That would be quite a feat if you do it. I've actually heard from some people who found the show and then, like crazy people, went back and listened to every episode all the way back to episode 1. God bless you for doing it if you have done that before. That takes a strong constitution, let me tell you. I really do appreciate it, and I really appreciate the men and women who make this show possible, the members of what we call the Reformation Gun Club. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener funded, and that means we don't have any sponsors or advertisers. We rely on the good people who are members of what we call the Reformation Gun Club and their annual contributions to make all of this nonsense possible. If you would like to join them, if you would like to support the show, if you would like to get access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content and invitations to our online hangouts, visit armedlutheran.us/gun club and sign up today. We take all of our contributions through Give, Send, Go, which is a Christian organization that we really do appreciate. They don't take as much of our money for processing fees as others, and they don't and we don't have to worry about them objecting to our content. So that's always nice. So visit armedlutheran.us/gun club today and sign up. We are continuing another episode in what is, I think, going to be a rather lengthy series of episodes dedicated to the chapters from my book, Duty to Defend, the second edition, which was published in 2022. For those of you who don't know and don't have the book, it is a collection of essays by ordained Lutheran pastors from around the country who discuss the various and sundry ways that God's Word is used and misused in the gun rights debate. They take the verses that are commonly misused and put them in context and explain how they are being misused so that you understand and can recognize how these verses are being misused if you run across them in the future. And I'm not going to be doing every chapter, but we are going to go through some of the highlights, try to give you a taste of what's in the book. If you would like to get a copy of the book, it is available at Amazon, armedlutheran.us/duty, D-U-T-Y. But you can also get signed copies. Signed copies are still available for the same price as the book if you were to buy it on Amazon. Go to armedlutheran.us/books and or go to the website, look for the links to the Armed Lutheran shop, and you can grab a copy there today. Today we are going through the chapter called Treasures in Heaven. This was written by the Reverend Philip Zielinski. And to give you a little idea about Reverend Zielinski at the time of the writing, and I think this is still the case, Reverend Zielinski was pastor at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Valley City, Ohio. He had been serving there since 2014 as a master's in divinity from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, back in 2004. And this is in reference to the verse from Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, it's maybe not obvious from those verses how in the world this applies to the gun rights debate. This is talking about the things that you treasuring things in laying up treasures in heaven instead of here on earth. And you might think, okay, I don't get how does this relate? Well, let me explain to you. And this is part of the reason for this series. Is I want to react to some of these articles, but I also want to give you some context as to the ways these verses are misused. And in this particular case, this verse, it's not very common, but I have seen it used a number of times to argue that you shouldn't, as a Christian, value the things, your possessions on earth, to the extent that you would be willing to defend them with lethal force. And that by being willing to defend your home with a firearm, you are somehow not a good Christian, because you are laying up on earth treasures that are more important to you, treasures that are so important that you would be willing to kill for them. And this misunderstands the point of armed self-defense and arming yourself for the purpose of defending your home. We have talked about this many times on the show. We're not arming ourselves with the intent of killing people over stuff. We've talked about this in recent episodes. We've talked about this many times in the past, that you should not be willing to kill over stuff. The stuff that you have is replaceable. The treasures on earth are replaceable. Life is not, and you should not be willing to take a life to defend your property. But this misses the point of owning a firearm for home defense, because what you're doing, the real purpose for owning a firearm for home defense is not to defend your property, but to defend your family, because you don't know that whether the person who's beating down your front door is just there to steal your jewelry and your flat screen TV, or whether they're there for something more nefarious. Reverend Zielinski is taking on this notion and trying to put in greater context these verses, so that you understand what they're really all about when you see them used in the gun rights debate. Reverend Zielinski writes, "Where is the Christian's treasure? There you will find the desires of your heart. We receive all things, heavenly and earthly, from God. In Luther's Small Catechism, we confess that God, quote, gives me clothing and shoes, food and drink, house and home, wife and children, land, animals, and all I have. He richly and daily provides me with all that I need to support this body and life." That from Luther's explanation of the Apostles' Creed in the Small Catechism. All earthly treasures are gifts from God, and we receive them with thankfulness. God blesses us with possessions, and he also protects our possessions by establishing the seventh commandment, "You shall not steal." Luther teaches that, quote, after your own person and your spouse, the next thing God wants to be protected is temporal property. And he has commanded us all not to rob or pilfer our neighbor's possessions." End quote. When Jesus teaches that we should not lay up earthly treasures that thieves may steal, does that mean the Christian eschews all worldly possessions and takes a vow of poverty? Certainly not. Jesus warns against the greedy accumulation of earthly treasures, which tempts us to value them above all other things. Luther writes, quote, "Is it wrong to have any treasures at all? Is this a general condemnation of everyone that gathers treasures on earth? Surely that cannot be the case. For if everyone were to behave the way you and I do, by tomorrow no one would have any house or home left. The lords and the princes have to get and store provisions for their land and people. That is why God created gold and silver and gave them mines. So we read in the scriptures in Deuteronomy 17 that Moses taught the king not to have too many horses or too much gold or silver. This concedes that he may gather treasures in moderation." End quote. Luther goes on to cite examples of prudent accumulation of possessions. The examples being Solomon, Joseph, Abraham, and even Jesus himself, as Judas kept a reserve of money so that they could be supplied. God blessed Job after his trials by increasing his wealth. Solomon received riches and honor so that no other king shall compare with him all his days. Jesus does not forbid us from having possessions, but he warns against the greed that would value possessions over and above faith. Money is not the root of all evil, but the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So let me stop there for a moment. And this is an important distinction. When we do talk about the fact that you should not be willing to kill over possessions, you have a serious problem in your faith life if you are willing to kill someone because they stole stuff from you, or to prevent someone from stealing things from you. And this is something we've talked about many times in previous episodes and in this series on Duty to Defend. I have mentioned this a number of times, that we have talked about on the show numerous cases where people have shot and killed other people, including accidentally killing their own family members because they thought they were being stolen from. Your possessions can be replaced. Your possessions are not worth taking a human life. And if you are willing to risk taking a human life to prevent someone from stealing property from you, then there's something wrong with your faith life, and you need to examine yourself, and you need to think long and hard about your faith, because this is what these verses are actually talking about. The willingness, the valuing of earthly possessions so much so that you would be willing to kill to protect them. That's something that Christ warns us about in these verses, and this is something that we need to be very wary of as we consider our own attitudes towards home defense. As Second Amendment advocates, we are advocating for the possession of firearms for the purpose of home and self-defense. But when we say home defense, we're not talking specifically about the protection of property. We're not talking about the protection of, we're not talking about being able to defend your home from vandals or people egging your house or spray painting your house or TPing your house. We're not advocating the use of a firearm to protect your flat screen television. We're advocating for the ability to own a firearm and to use a firearm to protect yourself and your family and your neighbor from bodily harm. It's a very different thing. Those are the treasures that God has given us and entrusted us with that we should be willing to defend, even with our own lives, even with potentially deadly force. But protecting our property, our earthly possessions, that's something we should not be willing to do. We should protect them. We should have, we should be willing to call the police. We should be willing to, have alarm systems and cameras and all that kind of stuff to deter criminals. But when it comes right down to it, we should not be threatening people with bodily harm simply to protect a piece of property. And here's why. Even when you're talking about just threatening the use of force as a deterrent, it's one thing to put out a sign that says, we don't call 911 or this house protected by Smith & Wesson or whatever. But when it comes down to it, if you are willing to threaten physical force, deadly force with a firearm against someone who is threatening to steal your stuff, what happens if that person calls your bluff? Now, there are many on the pro-gun side who will say, well, that's just the price you pay. If you're willing to steal from me, then you've got to accept that there's the possibility that you get killed. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't absolve the shooter, the homeowner, from responsibility for committing murder. If you are willing to introduce a firearm into a situation to defend property, you need to be prepared for the possibility that the person that you're threatening, hey, don't come in here, don't take that thing or I'm going to shoot you. Well, if they don't listen, then you either have to, if they call your bluff, then what you need to do is to let them go. Unless they then introduce a firearm against you or try to harm you in response. But what you've done by introducing a firearm in that situation is you've pretty much guaranteed that someone's going to get hurt. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that that person is going to respond in kind. Live by the sword, die by the sword, right? If you introduce a firearm as a threat, you had better be willing and able to pull the trigger. Now, I'm not suggesting here, this may sound contradictory. I may sound like I'm contradicting myself from what I said earlier about not using deadly force to defend property. What I'm suggesting here is that if you're going to introduce a firearm in a situation where someone is stealing from you, let's say, for example, and we talked about a news story like this on one of our Clinging to God and Guns episodes with Pastor Bennett, where a guy went outside, found that someone was breaking into and trying to steal a car, not even his own car, the car of a neighbor. And by threatening those, instead of going back in the house and calling police, what he did was he went outside and he threatened the thieves with a gun. They, in turn, drew a firearm and shot at him. He risked his own life to defend property. He could very well have died right there. Instead, he started shooting at them, risking killing people over stuff, which is never, ever justified. Now, if in that situation, the guy was perfectly justified in shooting back to defend himself in that situation where he had threatened, they responded, they called his bluff and shot at him, which wouldn't have happened if he'd stayed out of this in the first place. But what he has done is he's created this situation where he is forced to use a firearm and potentially to die or to kill someone else to protect stuff ultimately. That's what we're talking about here. That's why there's no contradiction in what I've been saying. I'm not saying that you can't defend yourself, right? But once you introduce that firearm, you have now crossed a threshold. You've now drawn a red line and stepped across it, basically, and said, I'm willing to use this gun to defend that piece of property you're stealing. If that thief then tries to shoot you first, you have now created a situation where you may have to kill someone to defend yourself, but ultimately because you went out and tried to defend property with a firearm. I hope that makes sense. Let's get back to Reverend Zielinski before I confuse everyone further. Luther describes all sorts of ways one may steal: wastefulness of workers, graft, overcharging, defective merchandise, and robbery. Some of these thefts are done in silence and secrecy, or may even be done unintentionally. Today, we may call them white-collar crimes because they're done in offices with computers and slick words rather than weapons and the threat of violence. Nonetheless, these thefts could result in substantially more significant loss of possessions than a simple mugging or home invasion. Jesus warns that earthly possessions are always at risk of decay and loss. As we possess earthly treasures, we know that they always stand at risk. Jesus calls us not to become so attached to those possessions that we're led into all kinds of evil. Any earthly possessions can be the target of thieves. Even the poor may be robbed, and they are most often. Most of the crime that takes place in this country is committed by the poor against the poor, generally. Even the poor may be robbed, and what little they do have may be taken from them. A thief, driven by greed, does not value the object, but only its possession, and will stop at nothing to have it. So should a Christian likewise stop at nothing to keep it? While laws differ from state to state, citizens are likely permitted to use deadly force only if they fear severe bodily harm or death, not in the protection of property. This is also a good and proper Christian perspective. This is what we've talked about many times. This is what I was talking about earlier. If someone were trying to defraud us by cheating or graft, we would have no right to use deadly force to stop them, even though these are rightly defined as theft, both legally and biblically. It would be a sin to value a possession above the life of another person. This is precisely what a home intruder who has come to break in and steal has already done. They have created a situation where anyone in their way will need to be threatened with violence to satisfy their greed. So they reveal where their heart is in earthly possessions. So what about the thief who comes and kicks in your door? What are you to do in that situation? Are you permitted to use deadly force to prevent them from breaking in? My argument would be yes. And we have made this argument in many, many different episodes in the past. Go back and look at Pastor Bennett and I, our episode where we discussed the Christian view of home defense many moons ago now. You don't know the intention of the intruder. You don't know, in the case of a home intruder, you don't know if that person is simply kicking in the door to come and take your flat screen. You don't know if they're coming to kill you or your family, or to harm you or your family, to rape your wife, to kill your children. You don't know what their intention is. In that case, it's probably best that you assume the worst. And in this case, threatening the use of deadly force to prevent someone from breaking into your home is perfectly valid, because at that point, This is very different from the situation I was talking about earlier. It may sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. In the case of home invasion, this is very different. In the case of a theft, like the one I outlined before, where you go outside and you find someone stealing stuff off your lawn, or you find them, trying to hotwire your car, that's a very different thing. Introducing a firearm in that situation is not smart. If someone is kicking in your door and you're inside your home, you have no idea what their intentions are. And in this case, you're best to assume the worst. Because if you assume the best, if you assume, oh, they're only kicking in my door to steal from me, then you may be very sadly mistaken. And this is why a firearm for home defense is really about defending the lives inside that home, not the stuff inside the home. But again, you don't know what the intention of the intruder is. So your best defense is to assume the worst. So you can, in that situation, threatening physical force, threatening deadly violence against the home intruder is very different from threatening deadly violence against the guy trying to steal your car out of your driveway. Very different situation. Seeing the guy out there trying to hotwire your car, you know what their intention is. Somebody coming to kick in your door in the middle of the night, you have no idea. And so by threatening them with physical violence, if they persist in trying to break into your home, if they call your bluff, in that situation, you have every right, in fact, you have a duty to use deadly force to defend against them. So very different situation here when we're talking about home defense versus defense of your other stuff, the property within your home or the property outside your home, like your vehicle. Thieves will break in and steal because evil does not respect how God has distributed earthly possessions or to whom. When thieves break in and steal, their greed will not be deterred and will execute violence upon anything and anyone that may stand in their way. They will break doors and windows and destroy another human being if confronted or resisted. They may. If you threaten physical violence against them and they run away, great. That's the outcome that you want. They kick in the door and you say, I've got a gun and I will shoot you if you continue. And if they run away, that's a victory. That's what you want. If they persist, however, they're going to reap the reward that they're going to reap what they sow. This is when theft becomes a matter of self-defense, not defending simple possessions. This is what I was talking about. So once the home intruder persists in their attempt to break in, even though you have threatened them with a firearm, now we're talking about a self-defense situation. The violent action of the thief shifts the focus to the defense of life rather than property. Now, this same shift takes place in the situation I was talking about before. Let me try and confuse you a little further. In the situation I was talking about before, where you step outside and you find that someone is trying to steal your car, introducing a firearm in that situation then shifts this situation from one of property theft to a potential self-defense issue. Once you've introduced a firearm and threatened a thief outside your home, if that thief then escalates and threatens you with bodily harm, now you've got a self-defense situation. But it was an avoidable self-defense situation, one that you stepped into by introducing the firearm in the first place. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Let me know in the comments if it doesn't. I'll try to clarify if that didn't make sense. Self-defense is not the defense of possessions or property. We do not value possessions above faith, above truth, honor, or the lives of others. We would gladly let go of any earthly treasure rather than break God's law. Our treasures are in heaven, safe and secure, far from the reach of sin, death, and the devil. Earthly possessions that God has given us are indeed good gifts. We help our neighbors protect and improve their possessions and their income and multiply their blessings as servants of God. Most importantly, we treasure God's gift of life as we strive to defend and protect ourselves against those who would try to play God by threatening violence in pursuit of earthly treasure. May God grant that you are never faced with a situation where someone's pursuit of worldly treasures places your life in danger. But if that time ever comes, may God grant you the strength and wisdom to protect the innocent and defend his precious gift of life. Gladly receive the blessings of earthly treasures from God. Receive them in faith with thankfulness and use them generously in service to the gospel, in love for your neighbor and earthly joy. So the point that the way these verses are used in the gun rights debate is to suggest that, if you own a gun for home defense or for self-defense, that you're placing, they're assuming that the only reason that people kick in your door is to steal stuff. They're making the assumption that the only reason that people break into homes is because they're poor and the society has, they're not privileged, they're downtrodden. Society has created the situation and forced them to do what they do to survive. This is the argument that you hear a lot of times from leftist Democrats when they argue against the laws, against sort of the mob violence you see where looters just kind of bum rush a store and steal stuff. The argument that people like AOC would make is that, they're only doing it because they're poor. They're only doing it because they need food, ignoring the fact that, the looters are walking out with flat screen TVs. So the assumption is made that, the only reason that people break into homes and steal, or the only reason that they break into homes is to steal stuff because they're poor, because our society has created the situation that forces them into these, our corrupt, horrible society has put them in these situations. And therefore we shouldn't be willing to kill them simply because they're poor and need to steal stuff. That's the problem with that's a misreading of the motivations for home invasion, first and foremost. And then it's also a misreading of these verses that suggests that, you shouldn't be willing to defend, you shouldn't be willing to own a firearm or to shoot and potentially kill someone who's breaking into your home because they're just thieves. The problem is that the people who say this never really face these situations themselves, and they're kind of Pollyanna, silly people who don't recognize the reality that the people who are kicking in your door may or may not be up to something much more nefarious, and you have every right to defend yourself against them in that case. I hope this all made sense. I hope this was useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions about anything you heard, please visit our feedback page, armedlutheran.us/feedback, and be sure to pick up a copy of Duty to Defend. We'll be continuing to read through the book in future episodes, and hope you will read along with us. Again, go to armedlutheran.us/duty or armedlutheran.us/books if you would like a signed copy instead, and come and join us in our future episodes as we continue to read through Duty to Defend. Until we get together again, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.